Authors Press.
Hello everyone, my name is Nicole Richardson and I'm from Authors Press. Today I'm gathered here with Professor Richard E. Vatz, the author of The Only Authentic Book of Persuasion, The Agenda Spin Method, and this is the 7th edition. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your book as well, Professor Vatz?
Sure. I am a professor at Towson University, wherein I have taught for 48 and a half years. Before that, I taught for a year at North Carolina State University, and I've always been teaching political rhetoric and political persuasion, as well as some related topics. And it's a field that has always fascinated me, and I've always been a little bit of an unusual person in my field because I'm kind of conservative. If any of your viewers know the name Howard Baker, I'm kind of a Howard Baker conservative, and there are we have maybe about 1,500 professors at Towson, and there are about 3 conservatives.
Wow. So I'm sure you feel like a minority there. I
do, but sometimes I'm treated very well. Sometimes not quite as well as I'd like, but I'm not confused about my position. So everybody has to deal with them, and I'm tenured. So if they want to get rid of me, they're going to have some trouble.
Right, I see. Okay. So could you tell us the significance of the title? Like, what does it mean? The Agenda Spin Method. What is that? Could you go into that deeper?
Well, it's also called The Only Authentic Book of Persuasion. And people ask me, why is it called The Only Authentic Book? It's because a lot of people in my field write about persuasion. But all of their books and all of their writings assume that there's a given situation. And you've got to be persuasive within that situation. And I am the first person to write on the argument that you create a situation. You create the situation that you want to be persuasive on. And so there's a lot more emphasis on the persuader in that kind of situation. Now, there are certain circumstances in which the situation is created for you. If somebody is dealing with a terminal illness, for example, or if somebody's in a hurricane, you're not going to be able to talk about, being able to give a good speech when you're in a hurricane, because you've got to deal with a hurricane. But right. Most situations are created by people, and I think generally persuasion is a phenomenon wherein you create what people talk about, you create what it means. But I do again want to reiterate that there is this situation, that situation that is determined by outside elements, but they are unusual. They're not typical.
Could you describe your ideal reader or your target audience? And additionally, who do you want to read this book, and who do you expect to read this book?
Well, there are a couple audiences that I anticipate for this book. One is academics who want to talk about persuasion and rhetoric, but the other is everyday people. People are always involved in persuasion. Who determines what you talk about? Who determines what it means? When you're a child, you have almost no influence on what the subject is and what it means. As you get older and you get a little bit more, in a position where you can influence people because of who you are, then you might be able to determine what people talk about. But you're still in high school and in college. You're still dominated by people with more influence than you. So after college, it gets more and more where you can determine what you talk about and what it means, but it's in all situations. For example, in marriages, there's a great deal of rhetoric. Who determines what the issue of the day is? Who determines what you talk about? You with your wife or your husband, do you have an agreement wherein both of you can determine what you talk about and both of you can determine what it means? Arguments are very often generated by either the choice of subject or the decision as to what it means and what it doesn't mean. So let's say that the wife controls the money in the house. All right. Well, is the husband happy about that? Is he sad about that? Does he want to talk about money? Does she want to say you spend too much? Does he want to say I don't spend too much? In other words, what does it mean? What's the significance? So what's the agenda and what's the significance and meaning of it all? So the agenda and spin are in every situation. This is why it's not just in academia that people should be worried about persuasion. It's in every aspect of life.
I see. So you want everyday people to read this, but you expect more academicians and things like that to read this, I'm sure.
Well, I expect academicians to read it and understand it, but also everyday people can benefit by this. And politicians and decision makers and office holders. For example, the United States is always in some fight with Russia about Ukraine, for example. What does that mean? Does that mean that we have a new Cold War? Does that mean it's just Ukraine specific? What does it mean that he invaded Ukraine? Some people don't even want to talk about that. Some people do want to talk about that. When you talk about an election, let's say the last election, are the issues inflation, crime, education, the border, or are they abortion, Ukraine, democracy? What are the issues in an election? This is always a clear question of who determines what the agenda is and who determines what the meaning is. And the outcome very often will decide elections, will decide leadership, will decide decision making. Everything is really determined by persuasion. It's so critical that people understand how persuasion works that I think my book is one way that people can understand how it works.
I see. So your book has very intentional, very educational intentions.
Yeah, it does. But the term education sometimes puts people off. It's educating, but it's also informing. So this is an example of rhetoric, right? I wouldn't say to people, by the way, this book will educate you. I would say this book might inform you, because what you call what the book does has an effect on whether people are interested in the topic. If people hear, it's about education, I don't need to be educated.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Little words make a big difference in your audience and who is interested in it, whether or not they want to be interested in it. It makes a very big difference.
Absolutely, it does.
And that definitely leads me to my next question. What are your intentions with this book? Why did you write it?
Well, I wrote it because I've always felt that the dominating position regarding how persuasion works is that the situation determines persuasion, not the persuasion determines the situation. So I'm trying to help people understand that the topics, the current topics that people discuss are topics because somebody has decided to discuss those topics. It's not because those topics are necessarily intrinsically important. It may be that they're important, but it may be they're not important. It may be that somebody has just determined that you're going to discuss this. For just one example out of many, why do we not discuss the horrendous stuff that has happened at the southern border? Because a lot of people with power want to determine that is not a sufficiently critical issue to be talking about all the time. Some people think it is. I mean, there are a lot of people who have died regarding the border situation and have lost their means for making a living. So, there's always a fight going on as to what we talk about, what it means, who determines what we talk about, and how long we'll talk about it.
What was your biggest struggle while you were writing this book?
My biggest struggle was that in my field, most people don't believe in persuasion being part of a choice. They don't believe that it's part of an agent determining what the agenda is, determining what the meaning is, and dealing with an audience who also may have some input on what topic they want to talk about and what it means. So most people in my field reject the basis of the whole persuasion effort that I'm making. And I think that, to put it simply, they are 100% incorrect. And because they're so incorrect, it makes our field of persuasion and rhetoric seem to people to be unimportant, when I think it's the preeminently important field.
For my next question, I'd like to know, are you pleased with the general outcome of your book? And I know that this is the newer publication that just came out.
I'm pleased with some people's reaction. I still get pushback from people in my field, my academic field, who insist that persuasion is all about recognizing what the situation is and just a discovery. And it's not just a discovery, it's a creation. We create what people want to talk about. We create what it means. And so it's a major difference. And I have yet to really convince a majority, although I have convinced some, I've yet to convince the majority of people in my field how persuasion works and how important it is that you look at it as the ability to create issues, not to discover them.
You said that there was opposition from other scholars that were in your field. And you also mentioned that a lot of people aren't willing to listen. What was the significance of that? How significant is it that people aren't listening to you?
The significance of that is that most people in my field are not evident in the media very much. Because if you believe that persuasion and political persuasion is just about discovery, then political scientists can do it better, historians can do it better, people in politics can do it better, a lot of people can do it better. If, however, the idea of persuasion is creating the salience, creating the issue, creating the meaning, then our field becomes much more important. That's why I do a heck of a lot more media work than most of the people in my field.
Yeah, the media has strong reaches. You can have a much larger audience and you can reach people all over the world. Having a phone at your fingertips is literally like having the world in your hand.
Well, I always say, I've said for the last couple of years, thank goodness for Zoom. I mean, it used to be that whenever I would do a television show, I'd have to physically go to the station and so on. As I get older, that gets a little bit more difficult. But I really feel that I can go anywhere now with the new technology, and I've been on national. I've done national shows, I've done international shows, I've done local shows. I used to be on. I was on Bill Buckley's Firing Line years ago. I was on CNN. I've been on Fox. I've been on local stations, and all of this is because I have a way of talking about political persuasion that most people don't talk that way about. And so if you type in Vatz into Google and type any kind of media outlet, you'll see that I've done an awful lot. And it's not because I'm so brilliant, it's because I've used this method of political persuasion that rings a bell with so many people.
This is not one of the questions that I have listed here, but I'm kind of curious for myself. What was the reaction like when you first started introducing the agenda spin method compared to now?
Well, I first started introducing it in 1973, and I wrote an article called "The Myth of the Rhetorical Situation," and it was an article that countered an article called "The Rhetorical Situation," which is all about people who think everything's in the situation. And there was a small number of people in my field that said, "Boy, what a great perspective." The majority of the field, I was just 26 years old. The majority of the field, got angry with me because I was countering one of their heroes who had written The Rhetorical Situation. And so they to this day, there are those who resent me for having done that. But that's not what academia is about. It's not about making friends. It's about advancing your position and showing people that there are new ways to look at something that are beneficial and more consistent with your field.
Yeah, definitely. This isn't necessarily science, but it is science. That's one thing about science and education is that it's not a competition. Everybody should be working together to create a general big knowledge.
But as you know, if you've read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that is not true. That is not how science progresses. It progresses just like rhetoric.
It should progress that way, though. Everybody should be working together. We get a lot further, a lot faster.
That's how it should progress, but it doesn't.
How could your agenda spin method be applied to this year with nationwide political persuasion?
Well, as I say, what do people talk about? The Democrats don't want to talk about inflation. They don't want to talk about education. They don't talk about crime. The country is going downhill in a lot of these areas. I mean, crime is everywhere. The crimes that were committed in the western area in this country in 2020, the Democrats didn't even want to talk about that. Now, there's nothing wrong with Democrats. Some of my best friends and some of my family are Democrats, so I love Democrats. But to refuse to even talk about matters is part of rhetoric. That means they didn't want that to be part of the national agenda. So if you read the media, which trends left, the media wouldn't even talk about all the riots in 2020. And that really hurt the country. But that's rhetoric. If they get away with it, then it's successful rhetoric, even though I don't think it's responsible rhetoric.
Additionally, how could it apply to the presidential persuasion? I don't think you touched on that.
Well, the question is always in a presidential election, what issues are going to be salient? What issues you're going to discuss? Part of that is determined by media coverage. Media will cover some issues, they'll not cover other issues. We see the jailing of Michael Avenatti, who is kind of an obvious criminal. He's a convicted criminal now. But in fact, a lot of the left-wing media wouldn't even cover him. And so he never became part of the elections up until this day. And so when you don't have issues that are covered, you are benefiting certain interests and hurting other interests. And the media have to be able to cover all major issues, not just issues that benefit the people whom they support.
Yeah, definitely. That's one thing about the media that I'm not a big fan of. It no matter where you look, it'll lean one way. You can't find somewhere that's completely unbiased. And that's one thing that I very much dislike about modern media.
That's exactly right. And you have to wonder, where are media who will be disinterested? That doesn't mean uninterested, but that means fair. And it's really hard to find media who are not on the right or on the left. I think, now people disagree with this, but I think one source is in newspapers. If you look at the Wall Street Journal, they are conservative, but they are, to my way of thinking, they're as fair a source as you can possibly find for looking at what issues are important and what issues must be covered. They don't reject issues just because they tend to benefit liberals, right? It used to be that the Washington Post was in a fair group. Even the New York Times, they're no longer. And now you do have, when I think the newspapers across the country, I really like the New York Post, but I wouldn't say they're right down the middle. But you look at the Wall Street Journal and you look at the issues they cover, if there's an important issue, whether they approve or disapprove of how it's going, they will cover it. So you have to choose your newspapers in a way to really look at critical issues fairly.
Yeah, because there's nothing wrong with leaning one way or the other, but there needs to be media that covers both, which is why I, and my grandma too, generally tend to follow a lot of newspapers.
That's the best way to do it. Good for you and your grandmother.
Yeah, she's the one who taught me that. She said the best way to get your news is to go to all the news. Good
for her. I have said that to my class. Good for her. She was never in my class, was she?
No, she's about 65 now.
Could have been.
Maybe. For my next question, I'd like to know why is the agenda spin method of persuasion the best for political media analysis?
Well, I think it's the best because it's not a method that simply advances one political perspective. It's a method that advances disinterest and understanding of how political persuasion works. All the other methods to this point are agenda methods. They want to support one particular perspective, and this method does not. And that's why I think that it's the best method.
I've just got a couple more questions for you before we wrap this up as well. You've applied the agenda spin analysis to psychiatry and mental illness for decades through the theories of a psychiatrist named Thomas Szasz. Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yes, Thomas Szasz was a preeminent critic of psychiatry. He was also a friend of mine. And he argues that it used to be, years and years ago, we would say 10 to 12% of the public is mentally ill. Then it got to 25% to 30%. Then it got to 50%. Now it's over 50% is believed to be mentally ill. And this is because psychiatrists can call any behavior mental illness if they don't approve of it. And if you have a lot of psychiatrists in a particular state, you're likely to find a lot of mental illness. So the belief in everything being mentally ill is a way to look at people as not responsible for their behavior. And it's also part of the insanity plea, which I disavow. And so I do believe that people have responsibility for their behavior. I believe people have control over their behavior. If you have something like schizophrenia, which people cannot even understand what's going on, that's not mental illness, that's brain disease. So there's a big difference between brain disease and mental illness. Mental illness is the rhetorical side of people's behavior. You argue that people are mentally ill. This is what Russia and the Soviet Union have done forever. If they don't approve of your behavior and they want to put you in jail, they'll call you mentally ill. And to some extent, in this country, we've become the same way. If we don't like somebody's behavior and we don't approve of it, we, instead of saying this person's a bad person and responsible for their behavior, we call them mentally ill.
I definitely know what you're talking about. And there's a lot of reasons why mental illness is more diagnosed now than it was then. And I think that a lot of that is right. A lot of people are taking mental illness as a way to write off aggressive behaviors or using it as an excuse when even if mental illness is the reason, it still does not excuse it.
Also, when you have people who are who believe that when they go to a psychiatrist and they're labeled as mentally ill, I mean, to them, a lot of them, they think everything they do must be due to mental illness. And it takes away their efforts to really correct their behavior and to try to be different. So part of it is a dependent society, a society wherein people consistently look for ways to interpret their behavior that mean they're not responsible for their behavior. A lot of people simply have to toughen up and realize that they can control their own lives and not look consistently for excuses and reasons to lay off their behavior on some makeshift pseudo-neurological label which has nothing to do with neurology.
I just have one or two more questions, and I wanted to ask you, do you have any other book-related thoughts or remarks you'd like to talk about before we finish this?
Well, I'm working on this, and this has all my attention now. So I think I'm just focusing on this for the time being.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I do a lot of writing in politics. I do a lot of op-ed writing. If anybody ever wants to look up my name and look up op-eds, I've written over 100 op-eds in the last 20 years. So I do a lot of article writing. But as for books, this is my current focus. And I've written on Thomas Zaz, and I've written on the only authentic book of persuasion.
Is this the only book that you have, or do you have other books other than this one?
I've written several books. I've written a book on Thomas Zaz. I've written on the only authentic book of persuasion. I've written, and I've got a lot of articles in books. My CV is really lengthy. As I say, I've written over 100 articles. I've given lectures. I really am in the public eye quite a bit.
And you really focus on those informative pieces, don't you?
Yes. I think of all my pieces as informative.
Okay, yeah. I definitely noticed that is a theme of all of your work, is that you're trying to educate and inform people the best you can.
Yes. Never trying to propagandize anybody.
And I take that back, because you're not even really trying to educate people yourself. You're trying to teach them how to educate themselves.
I like that, because in my classes we have a lot of debates about persuasion and a lot of debates about issues. And I think my classes, this is bragging, so forgive me, but I think my classes constitute one of the few classes in which students can debate tough issues. And the only rule we have is you're not allowed to get angry at anybody, and you're not allowed to deal with personal experiences. Anything else goes. And my students find that they're willing to discuss things that they've never thought about before, and it's just I think it's just great for students. That's a little bit of braggadocio, and I apologize slightly, but it's great in class. I just came from a class minutes ago, and we had a great discussion about the insanity plea and Vincent Gigante, who for years was found mentally incompetent to stand trial, and then they came to an agreement where he'd admit that he had faked insanity all these years, and he admitted he's faked it all these years, and then he got a lesser sentence. It was just bizarre.
That is bizarre. I just have one more question for you, and this actually isn't related to your book. Do you have any advice for Authors Press to help us better our services for the future?
Well, let me just say this about Authors Press. I've had one person in particular, Ollie White, who has worked with me. She is one of the easiest people. She's always there. She's never difficult to reach. Any question I have, she'll answer it immediately. She is. I don't know all of your employees. I know you and I know her, and I'm 100% satisfied with the treatment I've gotten. It's just wonderful. The two of you know exactly how to treat people and authors, and I am more than grateful to you, and I thank you both.
I'm glad that we can make you feel welcomed here at our company.
You absolutely have.
That's great. That's all the questions I have for you today. So thank you so much for meeting with me. If you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out to Authors Press through our email or our phone number, and we're always here for you.
I'm very happy with the interview. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. This has been Professor Vatz and Nicole Richardson. Thank you so much for tuning in.